Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. In this chat, I'd like to talk about globalization and to define globalization and give some perspective as to where the globalization sort of concept originally began, the various iterations and versions that it's gone through over the last 100 or so years, and bring us up to the present day, to its current definition. Its current definition is really the capacity to arbitrarily move large numbers of peasants from the surplus populations of the third world into the first world. So it's all about moving workers and consumers into where economic activity is the greatest, where wages are the lowest, for example, in places like China and Vietnam and so on, then to move labour-intensive jobs from the West to those areas. So that's what globalisation is today. Now, we can look at, say, there are subsets of that, like moving big corporations, moving money into tax havens and tax and management fee arbitrage across currencies. We can look at that, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But today, that's what globalization really has come to: mass movement, arbitrary mass movement of people, which requires either the dispensing of national borders, which we can see in fact, for example, the southern United States, and the crushing and removing of all opposition, particularly democratic opposition. So voters, white voters, of course, are just being neutralized in effect, so that this mass movement of people, the third world peasants, can take place. And of course that suits a number of large corporations, but really doesn't suit anyone else. Certainly is of no benefit to the local white populations, which is why they have to be crushed and silenced. But let's go back to the early part of globalization. The first, in modern terms at least, the first nation that amassed sufficient surplus capital to have a big opportunity to invest in anything it wanted to was really Britain in the late, or say 1860s onwards. They really 1860 to 1870 they achieved this. So the British had a lot of capital. The British businesses and investment houses. The City of London was at the time was the centre of, say, stock market activity and so on. British, almost 50% of all the ships on the water were British owned, which gave the British additional business in what's called invisible trade, which is things like fees, insurances, commissions, and so on. So the British economy, relative to the small island, the small population, was absolutely massive. Out of all proportion to, as I say, its population and size. Now, the British at the time believed that the world should be tariff and import quota free. So they had this concept of free trade, and which suited them because their industries were typically the most productive, their products were the best made and so on. So it kind of suited them. So this was where globalization really took off in modern terms. So, more than 100 years ago, and particularly sort of around the 1890s, this became a big deal in Britain. Now, the British wanted this free trade and tried to convince everyone in the world to go along with it, but in reality, very few people did. The American industries couldn't really compete with British industries, so they created high tariff walls. The Germans, their economy was really coming along, they did the same. And they also built up new industries and protected them with tariffs. So mass production in the United States, chemical engineering, optical engineering, dyes, and so on in Germany. Also, the Germans were quite innovative in doing a certain quality of steel and making sure it was high tolerance steel, or fine tolerance steel rather. And the interchangeability of finely engineered fine tolerance parts and so on. So they developed these industries and very competitive, high quality products. They didn't use tariffs import quotas to just become lazy and useless and so on, as many countries do, by the way. The Americans and the Germans were very focused, as the Japanese later were, very focused on producing competitive industries, producing quality products that they could export around the world. And in those newer industries, such as electricals and chemicals and so on, the Germans did very well, and to some extent the Americans too. And there was a story about an American salesman, I think it was from Colt, who came to Britain in the 1870s, 1880s, and he had six pistols. He broke them all up into parts, put them into a box, jumbled them all around, invited the British people there or potential customers to jumble them all, and then he just calmly reassembled six pistols from all these random jumbled up parts. Such was the quality of the engineering that any part could interchange with any other part. So that was, and then the British were suitably amazed at the time, because that sort of fine tolerance engineering that the Americans and the Germans were getting into was something that was quite new to the British. In fact, the British didn't really get round that until sort of 1915, 1916, before they had that. So each factory that produced something, maybe the same product, the same brand, but each factory would have a slightly different tolerance to the part, so that you couldn't interchange the part product to product. So, and this was a big issue in World War I with some of the heavy field guns. The field gun, the part that broke down, they just couldn't take a part from another gun or slot in a spare part. They had to have a part specially machined for that gun. The Germans, by contrast, could effortlessly move parts around, interchange parts, which of course gave them a huge edge in their field weaponry and so on. So the British were investing money all over the world. They were investing money in Australian sheep farms, in South American copper mines, in North American railroads, and they were stumping up the cash. And a lot of the development of the United States, particularly around that time, shortly after the Civil War, it wouldn't have taken place if it wasn't for capital that were raised in the London stock market. So the British were very active and very much pushing this idea of globalization, or what today would call that. So money, being able to move anywhere where it was needed, into any products to move anywhere, not labour in those days, but certainly products to move anywhere. Now, the British were made a big mistake, because while American and German and French industries were being developed behind tariff walls, and the penetration of British products was accordingly reduced, when these tariffs did start to come down, the Americans were able to, and the Germans and French and so on, were able to export their products to Britain, but Britain had no tariffs to protect their industries, and so their industries progressively became less competitive, particularly in the newer technologies. And so we saw by the early 1900s, if it wasn't for the invisible, such as shipping fees and insurances and the like, if it wasn't for that, the British would already have been in trade deficit in manufactured goods even by that time. So it shows you the British had gone from absolutely supreme in the 1870s to, by the early 1900s, they'd been overtaken by the United States and Germany, and handsomely so, and even to some extent by the French in the value-added thing. So a value-added product. So that was globalization then. Now, what happened was that World War I intervened, so globalization was put on the back burner. There was a brief resurrection after the war, but then the Great Depression came, so that fell to pieces. Then World War II sort of came even before the Great Depression had ended. And then after World War II, Britain was too exhausted. They no longer had the clout to decide what was going to happen in the global economy at the time. So really it was up to the United States. Now, the United States, because they had a huge productive capacity, very competitive, a lot of new technology. So the United States wanted then to kick off the new era of globalization post-World War II. But that fell to pieces when the Cold War began. So again, the globalization was put on the back burner. Now, the iteration of globalization that started to take shape in the late 60s and early 70s was more just about seeking new profit frontiers. the idea of globalization really was restricted because of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, and the fact that 60% of the world's population was locked up in some sort of communist or very socialist type economy and society. So there wasn't really an opportunity there. So the more modern iteration of globalization came about in the early 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, which released all of Eastern Europe into the world market, and of course Russia and the various satellite states around Russia were then also released in the market. But also at the same time, China, during the premiership of Deng Xiaoping, wanted to embrace kind of a hybrid sort of communist capitalist type system. And so that opened up, to some extent at least, that opened up the Chinese economy as well. So really in the space of a few years, the entire global landscape changed. Now, previously, the globalists, or what we would call today the globalists, had really seen that women entering the workforce, that sort of thing, that was the next frontier. But when by the early 1990s, the game had changed completely, and all these surplus populations around the world, where if you look at say a place like India, where population nearly 1.4 billion. Now, if you look at the amount of people that live as subsistence farmers, just living hand to mouth, they're just growing enough to stay alive. That's how close it is. There's a poor crop one year, or the weather's bad, and people are dying by the million, the multi-million. That's how finely balanced it is. So they've got a huge surplus population. In effect, their unemployment rate in reality, if we look at it in commercial terms, is probably close to 80%. So there's massive surplus populations in places like India, to a lesser extent China, but still, like, a lot of people there and not enough jobs for them all. So Africa has a huge surplus population, as indeed do areas around the Asian region. The population of Indonesia is more than 200 million, for example, and unemployment is chronic. You can go to look at an ordinary house being built there, and they may have 100 bricklayers, because there is so much unemployment. So you've got these people standing shoulder to shoulder all the way from the truck with the bricks, and each person hands the brick to another, but hardly able to move their arms because they're so bunched in shoulder to shoulder. That's sort of the sort of thing you see in these third world countries. So lots of surplus population around. Now, what the globalists want to do is to have the capacity to arbitrarily and at whim move those surplus populations into where economic activity is the greatest. In this case, it's the West, of course, all the white nations. Now, and to do that, though, they have to effectively decide that national borders no longer exist, and in fact, they don't. The United States has no border anymore, and neither does Britain, in effect. So people can just, third world peasants can just stream in at any time, usually helped by the NGOs, who are in turn organised and helped by the United Nations. So it's still a globalist scam, a globalist play, and then move those surplus peasant populations into the West. It has the benefit of lowering wages, increasing consumption, increasing the credit that the big financial institutions can then extend to these people, and so on. So that's the current iteration of globalization and the steps that it went through to the present day. Now, it hasn't worked out as the globalists had hoped. They didn't realise prior to, I think, 1916 just how much globalization was resented by the white populations. The reason being is there's nothing in it for the white populations other than lower standards of living and being surrounded by black and brown people who share none of their values. Now, no population is going to ask for that, not a single one. But because of the globalist control of the media and the fact the globalists control nearly all the Western governments, Viktor Orban's not really West in Hungary, but other than people like Viktor Orban, they control all Western governments. Then the ability of the globalists to push their agenda when Brexit came along and when Trump came along, they realised that it dawned on them that the white population, in fact, didn't want this at all, and given the opportunity, would vote globalisation out of existence. And that realisation sort of stunned them a little bit, and they still haven't really recovered. And many people believe that the 2020 election was rigged, and based certainly what on many people have seen, it's hard to think otherwise. Senile old man that never came out to campaign somehow got the most votes in the history of any presidential election in the United States. I don't think so. So the globalists have realised that the white people actually don't want it and will vote it away if they possibly can, and that again, that surprised them. So they're now going at full speed. They probably would have, if they'd controlled the candidates and controlled the media, they probably would have put Western white people in as boiling frogs and just slowly melted them away using that method. But because of Brexit, because of Trump, and because Trump's still around, and because they know they're not legitimate anymore, they know the white people don't want them, would get rid of them at the first opportunity. And they're now going at 100 miles, 1,000 miles an hour, light speed, for goodness sakes, bringing in as many black and brown peasants as they possibly can to dilute the white vote and to remind white people that their opinion doesn't count anymore. The current globalization is that we're not going to share power with the voters anymore. And if you don't like that white voter, then it's too fucking bad. We will crush you. We will humiliate you. We will shame you. And that's the current iteration of globalization and what it currently means. And also the implications, if they do get their way, and it appears at the moment they probably will, then the white grandchildren, your white grandchildren, are going to live in a world where democracy and the rule of law and due legal process are just something that you see in the rearview mirror, something that was a quaint thing from years ago. And of course, it'll be demonized in some way, white supremacists, Nazis. It'll be all that sort of stuff. But that's where it is. So I hope that brings you up to date and gives you some perspective on how globalization came about and its purpose and the iterations. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.